All right, yes, we can start. Um, so, welcome everyone to the final talk of the season under citing vulnerability. This is the second part of the series. And today's topic is arguably one of the most significant ones in ecological criticism in the social sciences and humanities. It's the concern of the United Nations SDG programs, and that is on waste. Waste in ecological criticism has been linked to discard studies, trash studies. There's plenty of work being done in the social sciences on the ecologies of waste, plenty of literature being produced about waste cultures, uh, and Professor Hervé Corvellec's talk is on waste and vulnerability. Welcome to all of you for this final talk in the series, and I'll now hand this over to Atul to introduce Professor Corvellec formally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome once again, Professor Corvellec, and if I may formally introduce you to the audience, Professor Hervé Corvellec teaches business administration at the Department of Service Management and Service Studies at Lund University. His fields of research and teaching are organization theory, and he has been working for a long time with infrastructure issues, for example, public libraries, railroad planning, wind power siting, risk in public transportation, and so on. He is currently heading the research projects from waste management to waste prevention and organizing critical infrastructure services. He has been an associate editor for waste management and he sits on the editorial board of Detritus. He is also on the editorial board of the Scandinavian Journal of Management. Today, he will be speaking to us on waste vulnerability. With this, may I invite Professor Hervé Corvellec to this talk, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm honored to be able to be with you, at least at a distance. And today's presentation is actually intended to show that our vulnerability to waste is coming from the fact that we tend to take waste as something normal. So that will be my point is that vulnerability comes from what I would call the normalization of waste. And this is what I intend to explain now. To begin with, I think it's important to have a rather broad understanding of waste. Waste is not only what you will immediately connect to waste. It's not only a matter of garbage. It's not only what you just throw into the bin at your home. It's not only electronic waste, which we know is a huge problem. Of course, it's also food waste, but that's not all of it. If you take, for example, the case of Sweden, and I know that from an Indian perspective, Sweden is incredibly little, but since this is where I'm active, I thought I would take the figures to give you an idea. You have 4.2 million tons of waste for household waste. Basically, an average, a little bit less than half a ton per person, metric ton. But already you have 24 millions of industrial and commercial waste, meaning basically 6 times larger. But you also have 139 millions of mining waste. Of course, mining waste is very different. It's ore. And basically, mining waste will be staying on the site for the mining corporation. But still, you already have an idea here that when we speak of waste, if we just focus on what is usually understood as waste, household waste, we only capture a very little part of the intensity of the wasting practices currently occurring in the economy, in the present economic system. And that's not all, because you have plenty of other things that could be qualified as waste, which are not. If you take, for example, ghost nets, those nets which are left behind by boats, which are killing machines, they still capture fishes and they attract other fishes and even other sea animals, because there is fish there being caught in the net. Those are killing machines which are deliberately actually creating waste. Or bycatches, for example, those fishes which are caught up, but which are not the species that, for example, a specific boat is interested in, capturing the fish and then throwing it away. It's also a form of waste. Or, for example, agricultural waste, which are due to the fact that at some point, for example, there's a season, and here you have a picture from the southern Spain, where basically you will have onions and tomatoes, which are going to be left out on the field because of the market price makes it unprofitable to collect them and transport them to supermarkets. So peasants prefer to just to throw them away to maintain a price at a certain level. Those also as waste, and they're not accounted for in the figures that I just mentioned. But look, for example, at an ordinary glass of soda can require between 170 to 310 liters of water. So that means that all the rest is wasted. And we should not also forget that we are producing tons. We are producing tons, something like 6 or 7 tons per person in Sweden, for example, by CO2 and more, all kind of greenhouse gases, behind the cars, behind the planes, behind the trains, everywhere. All those too as waste. So that's what I mean by a larger understanding of waste. And look at this one, for example. This is a picture about Northwest Europe at night, and you will see basically the region of this is London and the region of Amsterdam. All this light, which is lighting the sky, disturbing bird life, is also a form of waste. That's light which is not serving any immediate purpose. On the contrary, it's disturbing plenty of things. So my first point with that, if we want to understand our vulnerability to waste, we need to have a broad understanding of what waste is about, a rich net of waste. And here, it's intentional that I am not giving you a definition of waste more than this list of different kind of waste, because as soon as you will have a definition of waste, you will sort of exclude some of other kind of waste. But there is one kind of waste which is particularly connected to vulnerability, which is hazardous waste. For example, solvent-based paint, pesticide, batteries, motor oils, petrol and kerosene, cleaning and polishing, swimming pool or spa bath chemicals. That's kind of stuff that will end up in households. Pretty dangerous stuff that at the industrial stage will be taken care of with highest possible security, will be just suddenly handled without any special requirement by end consumers. And among other lack of care that end consumers might show for this kind of products, it will be that they might be disposing of them in an irresponsible and inadequate way. So we have to think that we are basically accumulating in our houses, where we live, products and stuff which will become waste, which have the destiny of becoming waste, and which are extremely hazardous. But we do not actually conceive of them as becoming hazardous waste. We conceive of them as oil, or we conceive of them as a way of driving whatever we want to drive with this oil, or for example, sort of pesticide and organic chemicals, which can be very dangerous, especially if they reach the groundwater. Because the thing is that we have to understand that this vulnerability is at every single stage. If I start from the last part of the picture here, and you have the hazardous waste generation at the industrial stage, and actually, at least in developed countries, it's rather well controlled because there is quite a strict legislation within the European Union, for example. And you will this, for example, as a stage of industrial laundry, or for example, as a stage of industries. But it can still be a problem. For example, quite close to where I live in southern Sweden, there is the former industrial laundry, which was closed down 30 or 40 years ago, but which were using chemicals which has been discovered to very slowly coming down to the groundwater. The groundwater at this stage is about 70 meters deep, and chemicals have been identified already at 30, 40 meters deep. And we know that they are coming down, and it's extremely difficult to stop it. So we know that waste from the past are going to poison water of the future. And this is the main groundwater area for the whole region of southern Sweden, where you will have both agriculture and cities. So you will have waste as well appertaining at the other waste transportation, with possibilities, for example, of waste being transported or things becoming waste, for example, when containers fall off boats, for example, in the sea. Or we know that there are plenty of containers transporting hazardous waste which have been disappeared, which have been fallen out of board and polluting. And you will also have at every single stage the recycling. Recycling is permanently producing waste, which is very hazardous because basically the recyclers will be able to take care of what they need or what they want, and the ability to take care, and they will have a rest, something that they are not going to take care. And that's definitely something which is dangerous. And this is, for example, a huge problem in countries where the developed countries are sending used plastic, for example, in Vietnam, to mention one. And there is, for example, a huge quantity of accumulated of hazardous plastic and hazardous waste in southern Vietnam, where there are plenty of small recycling companies. And you will have, of course, a problem of waste when you dispose of waste, because even if you have a very highly sophisticated landfill, you will always have water coming from the sky going through the landfill, capturing along its way plenty of chemicals, plenty of metals, and plenty of stuff that we have very good reason to consider dangerous, and taking them, it's called the leachates. And even the treatment, for example, incineration of waste can be, for example, a way of producing, an additional way of producing dioxin. So we have permanent dangers and a permanent waste generation at every single stage, and we are vulnerable to poor treatment facilities, to poor disposal facilities, to poor recycling, transportation, and generation. But we should also think that we have plenty of waste, of becoming waste, of material waiting to become waste. For example, the huge quantities of asbestos, which have been put into buildings for thermic and fire isolation and thermic isolation and fire protection. This is a very dangerous waste for health of the people demolishing houses, for example, or refurbishing houses, but it can also be very dangerous for the environment. If it's disposed in an irresponsible and inadequate way. We have to think about asbestos in building, which are going to be decommissioned on some day, as a big waste into becoming. And this is of vulnerability. And the nuclear waste here in a picture coming from Canada is very highly sophisticated and clean, but where there is a permanent problem all over the world about what to do with the final storage of waste, of nuclear waste, with questions such as, of course, the contamination of the local environment by nuclear waste, but also the fact that what will happen, for example, in 50 years or 100 years, there might be some people who find it very interesting to get all of this waste, for example, for manufacturing weapons. So there is a very big problem about final repository for waste, about discussing, are we going to keep those things open and just flag that it's dangerous? Or are we going to close them down and try to stop people from entering these? But we know from previous experience, not at least the pyramids in Egypt and other places like this, that if you close something very carefully, it just be an invitation for people to present themselves into it. So there is a huge problem about nuclear waste today and tomorrow. And here we're speaking of a lifetime of hundred of thousands of years, if not millions of years. So there is a question here. I just want to communicate that there is just as different form of hazardous waste and dangers connected to waste, there are different waste. And you have the microplastic vortex, for example, the fact that it's a 6 continent of plastic, which is sort of moving and finding its way around the planet between in the Pacific and the North Atlantic, with those huge gyres and microplastic sort of breaking themselves and falling to the bottom of the sea. So we have different kind of ways, and of course, being this, we have different kind of vulnerabilities to this different kind of hazardous waste and waste in general. So let me just mention a few of those vulnerabilities. The first one is public health. We should never forget that the reason why people have been starting to take care of waste in a systematic way came from the fact that, at least in the modern time, in the London 1832 cholera epidemics, people just realized that death was communicated by used water, and it was largely because of the entry into the water that people were drinking, both of chemicals from the leather industry, but also from all kind of animal and human waste. And we should never forget, especially in a time when we more and more try to consider waste as a resource, as a ways to basically make money, that the first reason why we must take care of waste is public health. There is a permanent vulnerability in terms of diseases, in terms of plenty of epidemics connected to the fact that a body, whichever body which is not expelling its waste, is going to suffocate and die from it. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind, that we are speaking here of something which has been identified in modern times since 1892, and you will even find very clear documents in Western Europe, for example, going back to the 1500th century about regulation, and of course the Roman Empire. Sorry, I'm not as knowledgeable about Asian history, but I'm pretty sure it's exactly the same awareness. So public health, of course. And this public health is, for example, today directly threatened by the entrance of plastic into the food chain. You have a bioaccumulation of plastic into animals, and those animals then being eaten by other animals and eaten by people will accumulate. You will have this both on the sea and with, for example, the birds and the turtles, which are coming in and out of the water because they will get the food from the sea. And this food being contaminated by plastic, then it's coming up. And something which is dramatic to know about plastic waste, that we are never going to pick it up. Of course, a few companies try to say, well, we are selling glasses which are made of plastic rescued from the sea, or some company will say that they have a special brand of shoes or maybe a special brand of shirt or whatever made from plastic recovered by the sea. That's good, yes, no problem with it. But compared to the huge quantities, the tens of equivalent of trucks which are dumped into the sea every minute, this is nothing. So the plastic that we are currently putting into the sea, and not only the sea, but even the sea waste toward the sea, the soft water, is never going to be taken out from there. It's going to be taken up by the animals living in the sea and sort of entering the food chain, and it will stay there. It will remain there. And that's really kind of dramatic and just importance of the urgency of the plastic treaty, which is currently under negotiation at a global scale. So we have to understand also that we are also not immediate. And you can, of course, think immediately about the working condition of the waste picker with the people working and collecting waste on the open sky landfill. And formal waste pickers are the large majority of the people working directly with waste on Earth. But it's not only the people directly working with waste on Earth. All kind of waste plants we can have a potential of representing a danger. For example, when in Sweden, the principle of burning waste to recover energy, both heat and electricity, was developed in the early 80s, it has to be stopped immediately because of the emission of dioxin. So there is a permanent risk of emission. Of course, there are plenty of filters, there are plenty of system of control, but this requires that they are actually brought into use and maintained. It's a permanent vulnerability to a non-functioning plant. And we know about the danger of dioxin, which can basically kill all form of life for large areas. So we have this permanent view about the vulnerabilities for public health and for people. But we have another way of vulnerability, which also will be connecting to public health, but it's more indirect. The fact that waste is immediately affecting climate, and waste is a direct reason why for climate change. And here I must absolutely like to relate waste to the notion of the Anthropocene, the notion introduced by Paul Crutzen, the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his identification of the ozone hole in the 1990s, where he said that it seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present, in many ways human-dominated geological epoch, supplementing the Holocene, the warm period of the past 10 to 12 millennia. Now, I know that the International Geological Association has said that we have not entered the Anthropocene. I was very surprised about the decision, but it's our decision. But the Anthropocene has become a key term, even outside geology, to describe the fact that we have entered an era where human activities have been so strong for such a long time that they're actually impacting both the quality of life on Earth in terms of water and in terms of the chemicals living around, but definitely transforming the climate. And here, I think it's legitimate to say that the Anthropocene, this area where climate and basically the state of Earth is become man-made, is the area of waste. Because the reason why we have climate change, that we have been emitting tons and tons and tons of CO2 and its equivalents. And if you consider CO2 emission as waste, the Anthropocene is a direct consequence of a waste intensivity across a couple of hundred of years. And here, if you are interested, I've been developing this thesis in this short video at the Vimeo, which I'm presenting with a link. The presentation will be made available to you later. So the Anthropocene, which is a characteristic of the time where we're living in, where climate change, but even the loss of biodiversity is a characteristic, is directly an area of waste, which is why I think the expression by Marco Amiero of speaking of the waste Eocene is extremely relevant, even though maybe I'm not sharing all the development by Amiero, but the idea about thinking of the waste Eocene means to frame waste as wasting. And here it's important to move from waste, which will be the material, to wasting, which is what people do. The fact that we are throwing away things, that we have a behavior which is all the time producing huge quantities of waste. This is what is meant by wasting. Socio-ecological relations. It's a way how we relate to the physical environment where we're creating wasted people and wasted places and wasted material. This is my first step in this idea of normalization, where we have become used to the fact that we waste. And actually, that to some extent, it has been sort of elevated even to a sign of progress. In the 1970s, for example, in France, some people say, well, we are not wasting more than 50% than the Americans do. We still have a long way to go, meaning that the objective was not to waste less, but to waste more as a sign of becoming wealthy. So the idea about the waste Eocene, I think, is the idea that we are living in an area where our waste is forming, is shaping our future. And here I really like to stress this extremely relevant observation by Charlie Kendall, that when we speak about the Anthropocene, that we're speaking about a crisis, a man-made crisis, where the maximum population era is likely to be the one of maximum human stress on ecology and environment, meaning that it's very when the population on Earth will reach its top that the Anthropocene will also sort of being maybe most striking, most important in terms of, for example, of climate change, biodiversity loss, hydric stress, and plenty of other problems. So this idea we are speaking of a gathering process because waste is accumulating. Just like waste is accumulating itself in water, it's accumulating itself in soil, it's accumulating itself. The permanent chemicals are just permanent and they are accumulating. They enter the food chain, they enter the bodies, they enter the soil, they enter everywhere, and they're going to stay there. And It will be the same, for example, with quicksilver. It will be the same with asbestos. It will be the same with all those products. And we have this gathering crisis because waste is a gathering item, accumulating itself. And this is one of our vulnerability. It's not something passing. We just add a little bit more waste on Earth, just of sitting a little bit higher on the dump, basically. And this is leading us to yet another form of vulnerability, which is the fact that we are putting, by this intensive wasting, a huge stress on resources. I very much like the expression by Richard Heinberg saying, let's pick everything, not only pick oil, not only pick copper, not only pick everything. Yes, I know that he has been criticized for this idea, and I know that he has been criticized for being kind of a neo-Malthusianist, always shouting that the earth is going to take an end. But I think the idea that at the pace of consumption of natural resources, when the population is keeping grow, even if there are prognoses that it will not grow as fast in the future as it has been growing so far, we might end up with the idea that everything is missing. And actually, it's already a little bit what the planet boundary paradigm is showing. And the people from the Stockholm Resilience Center, where the analysis of the planet boundaries, they say when 2009, 7 boundaries were assessed, 3 were crossed. In 2015, it was 4 crossed out of 7 assessed. And in 2023, 6 are crossed out of 9 being assessed. And it's not going in the right direction. Trespassing, crossing the planet boundaries, showing that we are creating now a huge dependence, a huge vulnerability to climate change, to biosphere integrity, to changes in the land system of the fresh water or the biochemicals flow. And we are still very worrying question mark about the acidification of the oceans, or for example, the load of aerosol in the atmosphere, or even the ozone depletion, even there are better data coming from there. So in a way, by our permanent wasting, the fact that we are taking out things and wasting and destroying the water supply, destroying the fields in some area, creating urban zones where accumulation of chemicals is extremely dangerous and already damaging for public health, we are sort of creating a vulnerability. And this is leading me to my key point, which has to do with the normalization of waste. And my claim is that we have been used to waste to the point that we don't see waste any longer, and we don't see it as a problem. Actually, it's very interesting, and that's one of the latest development in the discourse about waste, is that people say, well, there is no waste, there are only resources. It's actually the strategic motto of the Swedish Waste Association. There is no waste, there is only potential resources. This is, for example, one of the key ideas behind the trust and the belief in a circular economy, saying that this is going to be an economic system where there will be no waste because all waste will be turned into resources. This idea that if we are smart enough, we'll be able to turn basically garbage into gold. Well, the problem with that is just continuating on the idea that it's normal of wasting, which is, I think, an idea we have all the reasons to question. The first possible is something which has been actually identified by probably one of the most brilliant scholar about waste, whose name is Vance Packard, who in the early 1960s has been developing a book called The Waste Maker. And if you have it in front of my camera, you can see it. Vance Packard was a scientist journalist, actually introduced the notion of planned obsolescence, which I think is very well defined by Investopedia, the strategy of deliberately ensuring that the current version of a given product will become out of date or useless within a known time period. Basically, you release something on the market, knowing very well that it's going to break down or be out of fashion or it will be out of standard in a very short of time. And you deliberately organize this short life of stuff. These proactive moves guarantee that consumers will seek replacement in the future, which from companies has been considered as a very good thing. This is sort of providing them with a replacement, willingness of replacement, thus potential for sales, thus bolstering demand. But planned obsolescence is a calculating art of making sure the existing version of a product will become dated or outdated within a given time frame. And this is mainly, it's a deliberate strategy of producing waste, making things on purpose short-lived, making them disposable, making them, in a way, legitimate. And you will find this, for example, with the computer companies producing new and new versions, permanently new versions about their products, so that they're forcing people to discard this stuff. One of the decisions, for example, when the Microsoft Corporation decided not to keep up the updated, not to continue updating Windows 2007, where the fact that at this time it was the largest operative platform in the world, Microsoft decided that this will lead to a mountain of electronic waste because people will have actually to discard their computer because the next version is requiring much more processing capacity. So actually you will have a software company decision about not maintaining the program that is used, that has been sold to its consumer, to be able to sell new program. But at the end of the day, it will mean a huge quantity of waste. So the planned obsolescence, which has been, for example, a principle developed for hardware, such as, for example, washing machines quite systematically, or cars, or plenty of others. You will also find it in the idea of fashion. And fast fashion and ultra fast fashion is a principle based on planned obsolescence. You get the shirt of this week, but next week it'll be out of fashion. So throw away, use it this week, throw it away at the end of the week, and buy another one next week. I'm exaggerating just on purpose to make my point. But behind the idea of planned obsolescence, the reason why we have been completely used to wait is a pervasive consumption. We are sort of consuming all the time. This idea that consumption is all the time because every time you have consumption, you have wasting. It's quite incredible. But if you ask, for example, people in Sweden, if they make some kind of direct connection between their consumption and their waste, the answer will be no. People do not connect their wasting with their consuming. But of course, everything you consume, every time you go somewhere and you buy something, you also buy a future waste. There is no possibility of disconnecting yourself because once you have taken it over, you will either discard it and someone else is going to take it, or you will keep it, but it will be maybe stored somewhere. There are so many places where we are sort of, for example, storing old used phone. In Sweden, again, people have an average of 5 mobile phones at home which are not functional any longer. People don't dare to throw them away or don't want, but they are not working. So we have this idea about permanent consumption is leading to permanent wasting. But the thing is that, and this is the direct continuation of the idea of planned obsolescence, that many times consumption is not longer a question about covering basic needs, far from it. It's a question of consuming the new. Fast fashion is really the example. The whole point of fast fashion and fashion is that you have to keep up with newness. The point of a fashionable item is not that in a way you are just buying, I don't know, a shirt or whatever, trousers or whatever. You are going to buy a new shirt, a new trouser, a new something. This idea that you are up, you're on the front of the fashion. And which is why actually we're speaking here about things and consumption based on the renewal of acquisitions, not based on the end of life of the product, but based on the pace of marketing. It's based on how often things are brought onto the market. You disconnect the duration of use from the actual duration of possible use of a product. And then you create in the difference between when people discard it and people, allowing it could be used, you create, I would say, an unnecessary waste. So the new as a product is sort of always sort of putting back the old as a future waste. But there are other reasons why we're so much used, and I would call it hypermobility. You see all the people in these pictures waiting for the airplane at a German airport. All those people are going actually to produce a couple of tons of waste in the coming hours. So it's a pretty lot of waste in front of them, and they have not have a think about it. They're maybe expecting some late plane or whatever, but they are sort of thinking of their mobility and developing a kind of very mobile, hyper-mobile mode of living without consideration for the fact that it's wasting other time. It's just like the mug I've just shown, the single-use mug. If you are sitting at a place, sitting at a cafe, sitting at a restaurant, they will keep it and they will sort of use it and reuse it and reuse it virtually forever. But if you just want to drink and walk, you will most probably be using a single-use item. And this way, generate a new piece of waste for every use. So, I mean, in a way, this idea about hypermobility, this consumption, the new as a product, and intensive consumption are sort of deriving with this idea of planned obsolescence, that we are living in an economy which is deliberately pushing things toward waste as fast as possible. And this is becoming a way of everydayness of waste. Think, for example, that every day it's 1.3 billions of bottle of plastic bottle for water worldwide. So you will be a pile of plastic every single day above half of the height of the Eiffel Tower in Paris and much broader. The everydayness of waste, we have it in our hand. This idea that we consider it normal to go someplace and buy plastic bottle, plastic water, use it drinking and throwing it away. The sachets, for example, containing drinks, such a huge problem, which is clogging, for example, the sewage system in many, many countries. So the awareness of waste, I think, is really sort of symbolized by the plastic bottle, which is no longer seen as very fast waste. We're speaking about fast fashion, but we could as well speaking about fast wasting. And here the thing is that we have been also sort of systematically, and here the case of Sweden, it's a paper I've written, we have been systematically developing ways of pretending that wasting is innocuous and not dangerous and not a problem. And here it's a paper when I'm very heavy criticizing the fact that we have a separate collection of organic waste in Sweden to produce biogas and biofertilizers. And of course, there is a kind of a moral taboo, moral blame on wasting food. And here we have someone say, well, we can turn food waste into biogas and we can turn into biofertilizer, and claiming that this will contribute to mitigate climate change, which is basically the story behind the separate collection of organic waste. But the thing is that by doing this, you also make it acceptable and legitimate to waste food. And that's very interesting. In a way, by sort of developing sophisticated way of dealing with waste, you also make it legitimate to continue wasting. There are absolutely no incentive in wasting less. There is just this idea, on the contrary, that you can waste more because it's going to be all right anyway. And you have plenty of things like this. For example, the principle of extended producer responsibility, where producers, for example, of packaging or beverage bottle of electronic things, have a responsibility of collecting and taking care of the waste after consumption use. It's also the idea that, well, someone else is going to take responsibility for it. That was very interesting because when extended producer responsibility schemes was introduced in 1992, 1994 in Sweden, the idea would be that if the packaging industry, this is where it started, if the packaging industry is responsible for collecting waste and taking care of it, they will reduce packaging. The result was the completely opposite. It was an increase in packaging for the past 40 years, which has been continued all the time. So this idea about extended producer responsibility, it's a little bit like the food waste transformation into biogas and biofertilizer. It's a way of continuing intensive wasting. And here you have, for example, the European waste hierarchy is exactly the same kind of, I would say, narrative, saying, well, we are going to move from uncontrolled disposal to landfill to recycling, reuse, reduction, and end up with prevention. The thing is that it's not working. The thing is that it's just kind of, it's a hope. It's not something which is a reality. And we still have a huge quantity of waste disposal, which is at the bottom of the pyramid globally. It's exactly the same thing with the circular economy, which is promising an economy where, thanks to maintenance, reuse, redistribution, refurbishing, remanufacturing, recycling, there will be a possibility of sort of taking care of waste and making it as little as possible waste landing at the landfill. Well, the thing is that the circular economy is no less than 6 or 7% of the economy, for example, in Sweden or the Netherlands, two leading country. And there is, I think, it's completely unrealistic to believe that this will ever sort of phase out the linear economy. So that in a way you have a permanent and very diversified discourses, which is sort of telling us, no, but that's not so much of a problem with so much waste. But it is so much of a problem because actually this waste is ending up in the sea, waste is ending up in the air because climate change is a reality, because the production of CO2 and the emission of CO2 have not been decreased last year. It has been increased. There was just a pause during the COVID crisis, but it's going up again. This is what I mean. We are getting used to it, and it's very dangerous habituation to waste. We are wasting, and I would just like to say that it's pretty much an ethical issue. If you take, for example, this plastic item to make sure that the banana split will be composed of pieces of banana, do we really need that? Is this really the type of instrument which is worth the waste? And I think that we could actually ask this on many different problems. Is it worth the waste? And actually, if you go out shopping with this idea, is this worth the wait? If you decide, for example, about some production and asking yourself, is this worth the waste? I think that many times the question will be no, but it's not the kind of question that businesses are used to ask, and it's not an answer they are ready to listen to. There is a kind of global carelessness. You see, this is a picture about Northern Norway, which is an area in Northern Europe with very, very, very little population. The thing is that if you throw a piece of plastic just about anywhere from the coast of Spain up and north, it will sort of follow the coast, passing France, passing between France and Britain, going up, floating across the Netherlands, and then with the streams, it will sort of end up in northern Norway, where you have an accumulation of plastic. This plastic is not coming. No plastic is not coming from the people living there. This plastic is floating there. And you have plenty of places on Earth like this where you have an accumulation of waste, which are a symbol of the global carelessness that we have for the physical environment, where the question, is it worth the waste, is not sort of being asked. And by not asking the question, is this worth the waste, we become ourselves vulnerable because we have the picture very clearly that Anthropocene in the air, in the water, on land, in the sea, everywhere. From the top of the Everest to the bottom of the sea, there have been plastic which has been found. Plastic has been found from plus 8,000 meters to minus 10,000 meters, 18 kilometers high of difference. There will be plastic anyway. And this global carelessness is, according to me, the reason why we have this tolerance, for example, for hazardous waste. The fact that even, for example, the European Union, which wants to take the lead in terms of sustainability, cannot just say, no, we don't want any more of those permanent polluters, because we cannot just pass on polluters for all future generations on Earth, because it's going everywhere and we have no way of putting it out. And there is absolutely not a kind of, I would say, neither political or corporate decisions, which is that, I would say, at the pace of the wasting and sort of taking the measure of the danger that waste is representing for life on Earth. So thank you for your attention. And now I'm really open for listening to your views and having your questions. Now, just allow me to come out from stop presenting, and now you should be back. Is this correct, Pramod? I will back on screen now?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Over to Atul to run the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Professor Kovalek, for that fascinating talk and something which alerted us to an issue that concerns all of us across the world. And we have questions and comments from the audience. Roy has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Corvellec, for the enlightening presentation. Your point that efficient waste management normalizes food wasting, I mean, in the context of food waste, I had a response to that from Indian literature specifically. I don't know how relevant fiction is when it comes to the discourse of waste, but there's an author named Devanur Mahadeva who is from the state of Karnataka in India. He has written a short novel. In the novel, a family of socially excluded, untouchables are accused of stealing groundnuts, and the entire society of the village is biased against them. So they are looking for evidence, and the evidence that they are sure they will find is the waste of groundnut consumption, which is the groundnut peel. So if the groundnut peels are found, that is incriminating evidence against this family of untouchables. But nobody is able to find the peel because the untouchables, the poor people were so hungry that they ate the peels as well. The peels which are generally considered food waste. So here, I feel that this story, it persuades us to reconsider what we look at as waste. Whether the things that we consider waste are actually waste, or whether they are valuable, especially when we look at the context of, as you mentioned, developed countries like the US wasting a whole lot of food. I think the US wastes 30% of its food produce annually. So in that context, I think stories like this, or experiences from the global south or the third world like these, uh, they 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 advocate indirectly or directly an attitudinal shift towards waste, which might be more effective than shifts in technology or modus operandi, how we deal with the waste that is produced. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I completely agree that we cannot just rely on the idea that technological development will solve the problem of waste. If we do not change, I would say, our cultural understanding of waste, if we do not see that waste is a kind of legacy of our way of being, or way of behaving, or attitude on Earth, and we are going to keep it, to legate it to future generations. So it's a question, I would say, what do we want to leave behind? Why do we consider ourselves as legitimate wreckers of the planet? Why do we consider it legitimate to use physical and nature as a sink? Why, for example, do we consider it legitimate that, well, just because I'm thirsty, I am too lazy maybe to take the few hundreds of meters to go to where I would be sitting to drink water, and maybe the tap on, I just want to go there, I just want to have the convenience of it in my hand, then I'm going to use it in something which is going I'm going to use for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to throw away, producing a waste that will make hundreds, if not thousands of years to disappear. So it's pretty much a question about ethics. It's pretty much a question about relationship to the physical environment. And I think that the problem, the waste management, people in waste management are extremely clever, extremely good at taking care of waste, at least in the rich countries. And that's, yes, that's very good, but it's also pretty much of a problem, because by being that good, if they're really good, they just sort of, I would say, making fall asleep about the acute issue behind our waste, because among other things, they only take care of a small part of waste, which was what I started work from. They will only be taking care of the garbage and maybe industrial waste. There will be plenty of waste which is not taken care of. Among other things, CO2 is not being taken care of. Then we, of course, have a few efforts to put waste and to capture CO2 from the air and send it back into where oil once was. But that's so little compared to the huge quantities of CO2 that we are emitting. So it's pretty much a cultural issue. It's a pretty much a question about, I would say, understanding, and this is why I'm so happy to be here with you today, understanding that we are making ourselves vulnerable, or wasting is making ourselves vulnerable, is making ourselves creating a planet which is more difficult to live in, just for the fun of producing banana split knives. That doesn't make sense to me. It's That's what I mean. Technology is not going to help us alone if we do not have, I would say, a cultural and social change. Cultural change in terms of we see ourselves, we see our relationship to our environment, and behavioral change from the social science point of view.
Thank you, sir.
Could you send me through Professor Naya? Could you send me the reference of the story you mentioned, please? Okay.
Roy, can you put it in the chat?
Yes, sir. Sure, sure.
Thank you. I will love reading it. Any more question? Is there a Q question? I see there are 27. I do not see if there is a chat with question. Could you please help me?
There are
Yes.
questions in the chat, but we have got a hand raised.
Yes.
I'm looking for the chat here.
Myra has a hand up. Please go ahead, Myra. Yes.
Hello, Myra.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Hervé. I have a question. We are talking about cultural changes needed and so on to change something that we are doing. But what about regeneration of ecological systems if they are left to rest or if they are given space to regenerate and in some sense the healing capacities of Mother Nature and our bodies and so on, it is related somehow to detoxification, not polluting. But I'd be really happy to hear if you have some thoughts on that as well.
The problem is that at the speed of the production of waste, and now I'm speaking really the global view and broad understanding of waste, the systems that you are mentioning do not have time to come to a calm. And what we are thinking and the capacity of the physical environment to absorb human waste is no longer keeping a pace with the pace of production because the waste intensivity is much higher than the capacity to absorb it. Actually, there is a very interesting, just on this point, theory about it. It's called the natural step. And it's really saying that actually we're sort of accumulating waste on some spot in a way that we are making those spots impossible to live at. And I think this is a problem. But also the fact that, and I'm really coming back to the FAS and the different permanent chemicals, we're also creating chemicals bodies which have such a resistance to being absorbed and neutralized, even by human beings, so that that's really completely irresponsible. I think that for the moment, from the minute after we realize that those stuff are dangerous and forever, they should have been banned. And they are not, because of the lobbying of the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industries, the agriculture industry are lobbying for the continued use of it. And they come with plenty of arguments. We need this to do this. We need to do that. Yes, maybe, possibly. But what you are doing is poisoning the earth and the future for everybody, forever. And I think it's very serious. I think it's, well, you cannot just say, well, what I'm doing today is that important. Is enough important to make it impossible for future generations to live?
Thank you.
In economic terms, you would need a very high discount rate to sort of discounting future life to bring in the value of future to zero and motivate your attitude today. And I think it's a kind of contempt for life. Any more questions?
If there are any more questions, comments to Professor Corvellec, yes, Vicky Chen has a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Professor.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, and I want to ask about is something about the waste management and the relationship between to the resilience, because we talk about a lot about the resilience, and after this lecture, I want to discuss more about the relationship between these two terms.
Well, we know, and I think that actually, if you want to speak of resilience, I think that in terms of resilience, there is a population which is so incredibly resilient to waste. They are the waste pickers in the informal waste pickers. It would be, for example, the people collecting cardboard in Brazil, the cartoneros. So it could be, for example, people living on the dump in Nigeria, or you will, for example, have the Dalits, for example, in India. And those people have developed a kind of closeness to waste, where I think they are usually looked with a very contemptful view. People who have been in contact to waste, there is a kind of a stigma attached to waste, which very often has been moved over to the people dealing with waste. But if we are just speaking about resilience, I think that the informal waste pickers are showing the way about or to live in a waste-intensive world. They are living on waste, by waste, of waste. So this is where it is. And of course, the technological waste management is important. For example, the technology which has been developed to the final disposal of asbestos, for example, or the isolation of quicksilver. And I think that maybe an industry which is even more important than waste management will be the people doing with the sewage and used water, because we are running short of water, and many places it's already short of water. So we cannot just have a single use, linear use of water. We need to be able to reuse it. But if we just keep putting, I would say, dangerous stuff that we cannot extract, then we are creating a vulnerability to thirst and death. So this is where I think you will have a kind of technology, but I would really like to stress the importance of, I would say, the social software of resilience, which is a state of mind, an attitude, and a way of sort of living. There are very interesting films, for example, about wasteland, sorry, about, for example, waste pickers in Brazil, and showing how perceptive people who are living with waste, in this case, the cartoneros, how perceptive they are about the unsustainability of our current modes of living. How perceptive they are, and just taking a piece of junk and say, why do people throw this away? Why did they need it in the first place? Why was it at all existed, put on the market? And why was it thrown away while it's still functioning? So listen to the waste speakers, people who are usually silenced and marginalized.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Professor Corvellec, the short story that the novella that Roy had mentioned is on the chat screen. As on
Thank you. I've
the
already
title.
copied it and made the note.
Oh,
I will
great,
try
great,
to get hold of it.
great.
Thank
Thank you. If there are any more, are there any more questions, comments to Professor Corvellec's lecture? If there are no more questions, we could probably move on to a formal vote of thanks, which will be delivered by Professor Pramod K. Nair, who is the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies here at the University of Hyderabad.
Thank you, Hervé, for finding the time. And despite the fact that we had to change your schedule for the talk for reasons that you have outlined. So it's been a pleasure listening to the range, primarily from economics to the ethics of consumption, to the industry of waste management, shall we say. That is an entire industry that has come up around waste management itself is a frightening prospect to me. That you make capital out of waste so that you can generate more waste. The kind of cyclical nature of this. So it's been a truly amazing talk. And it is, I think, a fitting conclusion to the series that we had Professor Corvellec's talk on waste and related vulnerabilities that arise from it. I was also struck by the fact that the little bit of myth busting that you did about the global north and the kind of waste or waste management techniques that they have put in place and how it just doesn't seem sufficient. Too little, too late, as you've demonstrated. I think that has been an absolutely marvelous talk. So thanks to you for accommodating our request and our change dates. Thanks to everyone who's been here. Several of you are regulars, Roy in particular, our students, Atul for doing the emceeing, the recording, and things like that, and people from outside the University of Hyderabad system for being here. We expect to start season 3 sometime in August, and we're just lining up the speakers. So thanks to everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.